Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, you had the idea to do a show about rationalism, and I think not nearly enough has been said about it within Ayn Rand fandom. So I'm glad you brought it up and look forward to exploring the topic today. What kind of made you want to explore the topic?
Well, it's something that Leonard Peikoff talked about in his course, Understanding Objectivism. So I was curious, about it, and he and others have said that it's a big problem within Objectivism. I think later on we're going to actually play a clip to that effect, that where Yaron talks about it. So I've always, for a long time, have considered it to be an important problem in Objectivism, not just Objectivism, but in the culture in general. And but within Objectivism in particular, I think it can be addressed, and hopefully if we talk about it more and we investigate it more, we can find some solutions or some ways to mitigate the problem. So that's just basically where I'm coming from. I just want to investigate what is rationalism in Objectivism, and how can we address it, and maybe find some solutions.
Good. That all sounds great. Well, all right. Well, let's start with a quick definition about the type of rationalism we're describing for clarity, and because there's a closely related meaning for the term. The one that we won't be focusing on as much is the 17th, 18th century version of rationalism, which is a branch of thought of people like Descartes and Spinoza. Wikipedia defines that rationalism as the view regarding reason as the chief source of knowledge, but more formally as a theory in which the criterion of truth is not sensory, but intellectual and deductive. And it was often framed as being in opposition to the empiricist school of thought, like Francis Bacon and John Locke, which again, per Wikipedia, is a theory that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience. And part of what Objectivism attempts to do via Ayn Rand is to resolve that 18th century rationalist empiricist debate by identifying reason as the faculty which integrates the material provided by our senses. And then, as interesting as that whole discussion could be as a separate show, that's not really the version of rationalism we'll be focusing on.
I think that the history of rationalism can go back to Plato. So it's basically this idea that you start with these forms in your head and you don't know where you got them. It's just like a mystical revelation or something. And then you treat those as the truth. And then you deduce, all your knowledge from those forms. And so that's how you get the method of rationalism. And so I think that's kind of where the modern version of rationalism came from. Some people will strip away those original forms, and they'll just stick with the method. And so they may or may not realize they're doing it. They may or may not turn it into a formal philosophy, but they begin with some idea, and that's their starting point. And then they deduce everything from that. So I just wanted to clarify the history there a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because it's this kind of Platonic world of forms, which is perfect and higher than this base real world that they kind of want to stay in. Because, in terms of the methodology we're going to discuss, you're right, it's a concept that Peikoff explored in Understanding Objectivism, which he describes rationalism as an error in thinking, even if he's somewhat understanding of it since he dealt with his own rationalism. And it's basically an error, I see it as putting abstract principles and ideas above reality. Let's listen to him describe it.
Rationalism. Now, this is a method of approach to ideas which, more than any single other error, wrecks intellectuals, particularly good intellectuals, because it operates by corrupting them via the best within them. It attaches itself to a man's desire to be rational, to go by reason, to go by logic, to be objective. And using that, if he commits this mistake, it warps his thinking at the very root. So it, more than any other error in my knowledge, has negative effects on good people who go into the intellectual world.
So according to Peikoff, it's a method of approach to ideas, it's an error, and it corrupts good intellectuals via the best within them. And it's using reason and logic to warp thinking.
Yeah, I think the key there is that it is appealing to good thinkers or good people. And that's the problem, is that it's this bad methodology that is attractive to people who enjoy thinking about ideas. And so why is that? And I think the reason why it's attractive to these people is because it simulates reason, like a rational argument or thought process or methodology to approaching a problem. And it simulates it in like the form of logic it takes. So it takes like this deductive form, and you think, oh, well, it's logical, so it must be correct. And but the problem is people will abandon or just forget about the reality of the situation, and then they'll just focus on what's in their head. And so then they mistake what's in their head for reality. And this can be a real problem if you don't have a good grasp on reality, and the ideas in your head are kind of confusing or don't really reflect reality very well. So I think that's
and the more that happens, it's easier to stay in that world of ideas. I think so. But Peikoff also has a more strategic problem with rationalism because it alienates regular people from philosophy.
At the same time, it utterly alienates non-intellectuals and makes them decide that the intellectual world is a bunch of hot air, a bunch of floating talk that has nothing to do with life, that's something that gives them the creeps. And consequently, it has the effect of keeping those people out of the field altogether. So it becomes like a self-perpetuating monopoly of poor thinking.
So it's something crucially important, not only because those that are stuck in a rationalistic mindset are often disconnected from reality. I mean, not only is it warping their thinking, but objectivists that held a rationalist approach are making it tougher to promote objectivism because the ideas are being presented rationalistically. And he's even saying it's a reason that the movement hasn't been growing faster.
Well, I think that's probably true. I think that most people don't aspire to be philosophers, and most people aren't even very interested in ideas in general. Most people are just going about with their lives in some sort of business or, their day-to-day job, and they may need some guidance here and there in certain areas of their life. And when they hear an objectivist who's spouting rationalistic arguments that don't make any sense and aren't connected to the reality that these people experience in their day-to-day lives, they just tune it out. And then they think, well, that philosophy is not for me. So I think it's a very bad thing when we have rationalistic approaches to ideas at the top levels of the movement, and you start getting really crazy commentary on cultural things that are important to the average person.
Right. They're presenting it as just they have all the answers, and they don't, it's the kind of mentality that makes you not want to consider other points of view because you've already, come up with the perfect solution in your world of forms. But, you brought up the top people in objectivism. I mean, how widespread is rationalism within objectivism? Yaron seems to think it's everywhere.
Michael asks, do you think a significant number of objectivists accept the philosophy rationalistically? Rand's ideas have only changed their politics, but their psychology is still screwy. It doesn't become real to them. Yeah, I mean, that's not an issue of opinion. That's just an issue of fact. Almost all young objectivists, I might even say all young objectivists, are rationalist. I don't know how you avoid it.
I mean, the truth is almost everyone gets into Rand when they're young. So, rationalism's a bad thing, and it affects almost everyone in the movement. And he doesn't even see really a way to stop it.
Right. But I don't agree with him. I don't think almost all young objectivists are rationalists. And I can tell you why. But I think this is Yaron's ageism coming out again. I think he's very down on the younger people. And we've seen this before in some of our episodes where we covered him. But I think that the reason why most young objectivists aren't rationalists is because that's not how knowledge works. So in objectivism, you're taught that you can have a concept. You start with a concept, and you don't have to know everything in order to have a valid concept or valid knowledge. You can have in your context, you can have valid concept or valid proposition or valid knowledge, theory, whatever. And then as your knowledge grows, as you get older, you learn more and have more experiences. And typically, if you have a valid concept, then you're going to enhance your concept. You're going to bolster that concept with your more of the knowledge you gain from the world. It's not that you are rationalistic in the beginning and then you can only grow out of it by gaining more knowledge. It's your concepts have to be tied to reality. So even a young objectivist who understands that your concepts have to be tied to reality, which is a central feature of objectivism, he can be an objective in his knowledge. He doesn't, and so that will entail him realizing that he's not going to understand the whole philosophy. He won't understand things that are too advanced for him. But he will have, if he's like an 18-year-old or something going into college, he will still have plenty of experience under his belt to understand the basic tenets of objectivism, such as like the law of identity or A is A. I mean, you don't need a whole lifetime's worth of experience to understand some of the basics.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about ageism playing a role. You can't just dismiss every young person. It can be a tactic of older people to not have to deal with tough questions, to say, oh, you're just a know-it-all. And, the more you learn, the more you'll know you don't know. And because, this is a specific issue that, affects intellectuals as much as young people. And Yaron seems to tie it to a function of intelligence as well.
Usually, it's a question of how the smarter you are, the more rationalistic you tend to be, from my experience, because you're much more comfortable in the world of abstractions without tying it to reality. That's part of what quote smart means, right? In terms of just sheer brain power, IQ. It's also a function of how much life experience you have. Some people have more life experience at 16 than others. And it depends when you study the ideas. If you get to them at age 30 or 40, you're less likely to be rationalistic than if you got to them at age 16 or 20, right? It's true of everybody, right? Leonard will talk about how rationalistic he was. Harry Binswanger will talk about how rationalistic he was. Ayn Rand wasn't, but that's because Ayn Rand was the genius, the supreme genius here.
I appreciate his praise of Rand, but if it's objectively a part of being smart, I'm not sure how her genius made her exempt, or if maybe, she was like that when she was younger as well.
What Yaron, I think, is doing is he realized that his initial assessment that almost all young objectivists are rationalists was wrong. So like instead of just saying it was wrong, he made a mistake, he then tries to, mitigate it and try to explain what he means on he starts going through the list of concrete things, like how young you are. If you're 16, you might be smart. I mean, he starts thinking about concretes. And that's kind of a feature of rationalism, according to Peikoff. It's like you have an obsession with concretes. It's like you first realize that you don't know what you're talking about in the abstract realm. You have this sense, like this like feeling like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm talking about. And then since you can't figure things out in the abstract realm, you start going to the concrete realm. And then you start trying to come up with a whole litany of concretes and dealing with them. And I think that's exactly Yaron's method in this clip. I think that's what he's doing. And I don't think he reaches any real solution because he's kind of stuck in a rationalistic bubble when he's talking about rationalism.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in Peikoff's course, Understanding Objectivism, he says that some rationalists will do that. They'll just go into multiple concretes and just, even though they're not really connected to reality, but they're an attempt to just show he's giving examples.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's Leonard Peikoff obviously, explains this very well in the lecture. So I encourage anyone in our audience to go listen to that lecture on rationalism, because
Sure.
he talks about it in length and like why they go to the concrete realm. And he actually says that rationalism, in his view, is utilized by both rationalists and empiricists. It's not just a function of the rationalist school of thought. It's, for him, it's a method that's kind of like a normal way of working with ideas. If you don't understand objectivism, if you don't understand objectivity, you just sort of naturally resort to this practice, because all you have, what you first have is the thoughts in your head. You have the ideas you're thinking about. And so you normally would just focus on that and kind of ignore reality. And you don't automatically have the thought to connect your ideas to reality. So you just stay in that realm of your own head, your own imagination. And it takes an actual formation of a habit to look outward, to be objective, to orient your thinking to objective reality, and to figure out, are your ideas correlating or corresponding to that reality?
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight, that even within empiricism, which is supposed to be, the other side of the dichotomy of rationalism, that they can still take a rationalistic approach. I think because it's it can happen among intellectuals. And, we've talked about how Peikoff was dealing with his own rationalism. Yaron even tells the story of how Rand helped him deal with his rationalism by getting him to walk around some.
Ayn Rand, in order for Leonard Peikoff to cure his rationalism, used to send him on walks. She'd take this abstract concept we're trying to understand, and she would say, go find it on Fifth Avenue. Go find this abstraction on Fifth Avenue. So in a sense, go see it. Go find examples of it. Go concretize it for yourself. And if Ayn Rand could do that to Leonard Peikoff, all of us should be doing it, right? Because all of us probably need it. So,
I'm not sure how appropriate it is to talk about it as a cure, but that in fact it's something that we need to be vigilant against always.
Right. But I think the key is to understand it as a method of, as Peikoff says, a method of approaching ideas. So you gotta identify your own method, what you're doing, the habits you're engaging in mentally. And if you can't do that, you need someone else to do it for you. You need someone else to come in and look at you and talk to you and analyze your process of thought and explain to you what you're doing, because you're trapped in the bubble. You don't understand. Maybe you don't know what the proper method is, so you can't differentiate yours from the proper method. It's something that I think other people need to point out to you, and often they'll do it, but they won't say, "Oh, you're being a rationalist." They'll say, "Oh, you're rewriting history, or you're making things up, or you don't have a grasp on reality." They'll say things that mean, in essence, that you're a rationalist, but you won't grasp it that way. It won't register to you that way.
Right. So, I mean, there's not just one day that someone, even an objectivist under Ayn Rand's tutelage, gets cured. I mean, when did this cure happen? What year?
You mean with Peikoff?
Right. I mean, when he was cured of his rationalism.
Oh, I don't know. It's an ongoing problem, probably. I think
Yeah.
if you started with this methodology, which is probably taught to many people, and I'm sure there are many objectivists who come into objectivism with the rationalistic methodology, it's going to take time for you to grow out of it or figure it out. Even if you do identify yourself as a rationalist, or a struggling rationalist, maybe you compartmentalize your rationalism. Like in some areas where you're all confused about things, you act as a rationalist, but in other areas where you're very grounded in reality and you understand all the facts, you don't have to resort to that methodology. You can, like, someone questions your view of capitalism and you have all the facts. But if someone questions your view of art and you're not really tuned into the art world, or you don't have all kinds of examples, or you haven't induced the principles of art, then you just make stuff up and you sound like a rationalist. So I think it's an ongoing issue. I don't know when a particular person suddenly is not a rationalist. I think it's something you can revert to. It's kind of like a vestigial part of your thinking. So if you ever lapse in concentration or focus, you could revert to that bad methodology again. And an older person who can't remember all the ways of being objective and can't always remember to look to reality and check my facts, check my premises, he'll just revert back to his old ways. And so even later in life, he'll still show signs of rationalism.
Yeah, and that's why I'm just wary of Yaron presenting it as a cure, or that he was cured.
Well,
it's a process like rationality.
Like you can be cured of a disease and then get the disease again. So I don't know if we should harp on this language. I think
that's fine.
Yeah, I think if you can cure your rationalism in one area, maybe, and then you could be a rationalist in another area, and then you have to cure yourself in that area.
Right. Well, just as more example for how widespread this is in the history of the objectivist movement, Carl Barney talked about rationalism on one of his articles, and we'll put a link up to it. But he says by 2002, there was so much concern about widespread rationalism within the Ayn Rand Institute and the objectivist community that the ARI board created a rationalism resolution task force. I was asked to chair it. On the task force were John Allison, Harry Binswanger, Yaron Brook, and John Ridpath. We met and discussed issues and came up with a list of action items to combat rationalism. Some of these things have been done, but many have not. And like I said, we'll put up a link to the suggestions as well that they came up with. But Barney continues, Dr. Peikoff told me that Onkar Ghate, chief philosophic officer at ARI, was the worst student he ever had. He said this several times with emphasis. I told him I had never repeated it, but that I might find occasion to, and asked if he would mind being quoted. Peikoff answered that it was okay to repeat, but to be sure to explain what it meant. Again, this is Barney relaying Peikoff's words, that Onkar was the worst rationalist by far he had ever encountered. He went on to say he was extremely concerned because he knew what it took him to combat rationalism. He was coached and mentored intensively and long by Ayn Rand personally, and Peikoff doubted that Onkar would ever be able to overcome it. And to be fair, Barney adds parenthetically, this is not a moral criticism of Onkar, and it's not to say that he may not be combating it. It is something of concern, and it does explain some of the problems at ARI. So Peikoff was very concerned about Onkar's level of rationalism, which he seems to think was significantly worse than even most other objectivists. I hope Onkar's gotten over it.
Well, I don't really like to take Barney's word for anything that Peikoff may or may not have said. So I don't really have an opinion on Onkar's status as a student under Peikoff. So yeah, I'm not really comfortable talking about that
That's
idea.
fine. Look, the bottom line is they were desperate to discredit Barney. If Peikoff didn't actually say that, that would have been one of the easiest things to check with Peikoff and come out. But instead, they elected to say, oh, let's just call all the charges arbitrary and not answer any of them.
Right. I mean, in terms of refuting charges, I think they could have handpicked the most important ones instead of blanketly calling them arbitrary. I think there were some charges that could have been dealt with, in an open public manner, and we would have had most of the evidence. Like if they had just replied to his charges about breaking the contract, like did or did not I enter a contract with Barney, and did Barney state that contract accurately, or did he misrepresent it? I mean, that's not a very hard thing to do. They can just one line, they could say Barney misrepresented the contract and we don't want to deal with him.
But even looking for material, beyond the charges, I mean, maybe Onkar could make a statement about how he, is over his rationalism, or that he's been combating it, or even say that particular charge is arbitrary. But, how arbitrary is it to suggest that an objectivist may be guilty of rationalism if everyone's doing it?
Well, I just think it's up to Onkar. I mean, it's up to him whether he thinks it's a valid thing to talk about. I mean, if he cares. So it's really up to him. Does he care what Barney says?
Does he care if Peikoff thinks it?
Oh, well, if he cared, he could go directly to Peikoff.
Yeah, there's no reason to believe he's done that. I mean, everyone knows Barney and Peikoff are tight, and you want to go to someone and have them call you a rationalist?
I don't know. I mean, Peikoff could have been saying that in the beginning he was a big rationalist, just like Peikoff was a big rationalist and had to go to Ayn Rand. So, but then maybe part of the context is that Onkar got better. Like he's not rationalistic, so maybe he got better.
Well, it's possible. Barney goes on to say, some students of objectivism make cavalier psychological and inappropriate ethical evaluations of others. In judging and criticizing someone, justice requires us to acknowledge the full context of relevant facts about that individual, both positives and negatives. So Barney seems to see the rationalism of objectivists leading to uninformed, quick judgments that aren't taking everything into account. He's probably thinking at least partially about his own treatment at the time.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of rationalism in generally speaking, is that and you see this with Yaron actually, is where his opponents are always dishonest. That's his go-to word or his epithet that he uses for people he doesn't like. So if, and that's a sign that he's just, trying to attack a particular aspect of someone's character, and he's not really looking at all the aspects or judging a person based on all the important relevant factors. So usually his accusations of dishonesty turn out to be ridiculous. And it's just something he spouted out. So
Yeah,
I
well,
think it is. Yeah, go ahead.
That's a rationalistic mindset of saying, I'm right in what I think. Everyone should be able to see it. Therefore, if they can't, they must be dishonest
Yeah.
and not
Yeah,
taking context.
yeah, it's ignoring it's ignoring a good chunk of reality, which includes someone's full character. Even like the motivations. Like, if you don't ask someone or pry into their motivations, how do you know if they're dishonest? I mean, you just kind of assume that since they radically depart from your beliefs, they must be dishonest because you're honest, right? And so any honest person would come to your conclusions.
Well, you talk about motives. I mean, calling someone dishonest happens to be a convenient excuse for not having to answer relevant charges.
Yeah, it's putting the focus on someone else's psychology and not your own.
Yeah,
But it's usually just an arbitrary accusation. It's ridiculous.
that's true. I wanted to just say, I think that Rand's view of settling for no less than moral perfection can play a role in how widespread rationalism is in the movement. I mean, I can appreciate a perfectionist view as an aspiration, seeking a more perfect union. But, where do imperfections occur? In reality, in the real world. So, when it's easier for someone to retreat into rationalistic bubbles or ivory towers in a misguided quest for staying morally perfect. But they don't realize that you're not perfect if you're stuck in the world of abstraction. You're just not paying attention to the full context of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I can see some of that, but I'm not sure how much the moral ideal. I mean, the moral ideal is not exclusive to Rand's philosophy.
Neither is rationalism. It's throughout intellectual movements.
Right. But I don't see the moral ideal in general being something that would drive you to rationalism, because it kind of depends on your concept of what the moral ideal means. It's like, if it's some supernatural sort of idealism, then yeah, you're going to just be stuck in that ideal rationalistic world. But if your moral ideal is grounded in the concept of, rational man, and, a man going through a life where he has to learn things, so he's going to be mistaken in some areas, and then learn from his mistakes, and then try to better himself. And so you kind of take a more grounded look at it over the course of someone's life, and you say, well, they're ideal in the sense that they have the right ideas and they're pursuing those ideas. But if they make mistakes, that doesn't mean they're not the moral ideal. It just means they've made a decision that led to a mistake. And so, then if you point out that mistake and then they learn from their mistakes, then they're still on the course towards, becoming the ideal in reality. So it's
right. But it's the rationalist sitting on the sideline and saying, oh, that guy's not doing it right. He's imperfect. And, that therefore, I'm better than him, even though he's doing something and you're not.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult concept to pick apart for me. I don't know. So if there's someone who's an idealist and he's sitting there saying, I know the perfect way to do things and you're not doing it perfectly, and so therefore you're not ideal. I don't know where that would come from. I'm not sure if it comes from rationalism or if it just comes from like arrogance or something else, where you just think that only the ideal is acceptable. Like, you won't act unless you got the plan down perfect. That's kind of like what a procrastinator would say, right? He's saying, well, I'm not acting because I haven't quite worked out all the details of how to get what I want. Right. So
Yeah.
it's like if someone wants like a wife, and he's got this idea of the perfect wife, and none of the women he meets meet that criteria of a perfect wife, so he'll never date anyone. Right. So that's kind of like, does that come from rationalism?
Well, I think procrastination can come from rationalism. It's real easy to have these, great ideas about how you're going to change the world. And it's once you start doing it, it's like, oh gosh, what I wrote doesn't sound as perfect as it was in my head.
Maybe it is. Maybe it comes from the fear of dealing with a reality that isn't what's in your head, that isn't your rationalistic conception of what's good. And so you realize you don't want to have to face the reality that your idea in your head is not achievable in reality.
Yeah, and that's
like
not the only reason people procrastinate, but it can be one.
Yeah. I think I was sort of that way in high school when I was religious. I had this religious idea of perfection and how you should act, and I wanted to like sacrifice myself for the good of something. And then it took a while to grow out of that once I discovered objectivism, and I realized that's ridiculous. So and then a lot of people have the concept of like a perfect mate, or like the soul mate, right? There's one person out there who's just right for you. And I always thought that was ridiculous, and probably a bit idealistic, if not rationalistic.
Yeah, I think that's definitely out there. And another aspect of rationalism is being kind of a know-it-all. In this next clip, a listener makes a comment to Yaron complaining about objectivists being smeared as know-it-alls, but Yaron says there's a legitimate aspect to that criticism because of rationalism.
I know too many objectivists who don't know it all, but pretend to know it all, or delude themselves into thinking they know it all. I know objectivists who think that because they've read Ayn Rand and because they know philosophy, or they know Ayn Rand's philosophy, they know everything about economics and about politics and about genetic engineering and about physics, and they have a theory about quantum mechanics, and they have a theory about everything. That knowledge, philosophical knowledge, grants you knowledge in everything. I knew people like that. I've known people like that. I see a lot of young objectivists who believe that. I probably held that for a while.
He probably held that for a while? Well,
yeah, he probably definitely did.
Probably admitting it is probably the first step to probably fixing it.
Yeah.
And again, when Yaron says for a while, can we get an estimate on when he was fixed?
First of all, it's hard to tell when Yaron is using exaggeration for emphasis or if he actually means it. Like he says that he knows people who think they know everything about everything. Well, I don't really know anybody like that. I understand what the know-it-all euphemism or epithet, I know how that's used to attack people and create a straw man. You say, oh, you're a know-it-all, but it's usually a term used by dumb people who are attacking smart people and trying to attack their character because they're smart.
It's people who don't like being corrected.
Yeah, it's like people who don't want to argue, like you say, they don't want to be challenged. And so they call you a know-it-all, and they use this epithet as an ad hominem attack. Oh, you're a know-it-all, therefore nobody should listen to you. Well, if you were a literal know-it-all, then everyone should listen to you. But there are people, I understand there are people out there who just bullshit, and I consider Yaron one of those people. They just go on and bullshit and go on rants, and it's just terrible.
I mean,
It's
he's a
like,
smart man. He can get away with it a lot of the time.
yeah, but I think he's projecting. He's just projecting the know-it-allism onto other people, but it's really him. So I just wanted to put that out there. And another aspect of this is that what is a know-it-all? A know-it-all literally would be an omniscient person. And this is one of the features of rationalism that Peikoff brought up. He said that the rationalist achieves certainty through omniscience. So unless you know everything about all the concretes, and this goes back to his focus on concretes, is that you have to know all this information. You have to be this mature adult with gray hair, and you can't be this young person who's all rationalistic. You have to know, you have a lifetime experience and experience the world and know everything, and then you can achieve certainty. So you can be a know-it-all. But if you don't have this near omniscient level of knowledge that, of course, objectivists don't believe in omniscience, but he's turning omniscience into this sort of like elderly, wise grasp of all the concretes and all the real life experiences. That's his version of omniscience.
But he
And then,
seemed to be taking your side a little bit when he was complaining about know-it-alls that thought they were omniscient.
I know, but he's just using it as a smear tactic.
Okay. Well,
I think it is a confusing, it's a confusing issue, but because I think he's confused about certainty, he's confused about knowledge and all of this. And so,
yes.
when he recognizes this, I don't even know if he recognizes this in himself, but he clearly talks. He's a pundit on the internet who just talks about everything, has an opinion about everything, and occasionally he'll say, "I'm not an expert, but here's my opinion," and then so he frames it as he will answer questions about everything, and you should listen to him on everything. But then he attacks other people for being know-it-alls and thinking they know everything. So it's kind of like I think it's a projection going on, psychological projection.
Well, that's fair. This next clip to me is, we've played it on a separate show, but to me, it's an example of what I think is rationalism. Yaron in the past has said that the left has been winning for the last 100 years, but yet he still can't think of any ideas to work with other liberty groups on.
Right? Everybody says to me all the time, why doesn't Ayn work with Cato? And my answer is, on what? What would we, literally, what's the program on which we would work with Cato? They do their thing, we do our thing. We're not, some things there's overlap, but what would we do together? Intellectual work is not done together. It's just done. And that's what needs to be done.
That is a convenient excuse not to work with any other groups, that you can't think of any other ideas. And then to say at the end, oh, intellectual work is just done by itself in each rationalist's mind.
Yeah. What I think he's not focusing on is that ARI is allegedly an educational organization. So they could work on educational programs with Cato. They don't have to do just intellectual work. It's like he's narrowing, and this is another thing that rationalists do, is they narrow the focus of some subject to exclude things that don't fit with their view. So his view is that, there's nothing to work on with Cato. So he has to narrow his view to intellectual products, right? So since and I don't even agree with this view, but he says that intellectual work is done, privately, not together, I guess, not collectively. So that's his view there, to rationalize his view that there's nothing to work on with Cato. But there's all kinds of other things you can do. There's, media appearances, there's debates, there's like I said before, you could work on educational programs, and they probably do that. I don't even know. I don't know. Do they go to like Cato conferences or go to Cato meetings and work on educational programs? I don't even know.
Well, John Allison was like the head on the board of Cato for a while. So, I mean, they certainly had opportunity if they wanted to. But the deeper issue, I think, has to do with back to the perfectionism and the sanction. Because if you already know it all, what possible benefit could there be in working with others in the outside world and having to deal with their intellectual imperfections?
Yeah, I mean, at one point, I said they wanted to spearhead a cultural renaissance, but it doesn't seem like they want to do that anymore. So
They want the
wouldn't.
cultural renaissance to come to them.
Yeah, they want the easiest approach, the easiest method.
That's right. Now, one issue that Yaron and Peikoff bring up, and even you brought up, is how learning is an inductive process, and that rationalism is when the person just wants to stay in the mode of constant deduction. But when we talk about what was missing from objectivism, it was a theory of induction. I mean, that's why Peikoff wrote a book on induction with David Harriman in 2010. I mean, is it fair to wonder if Rand's lack of formal work on induction played a role in how rationalistic almost all young objectivists get?
Perhaps if the only thing you look at is Rand's work, but I do think there has been good work on induction by non-objectivists throughout history. So if you're genuinely interested in that method of gaining knowledge, you would research that, that history of philosophy where they talk about induction and inductive methods, inductive proofs. So, but in general, I think humans, so logic is just the identification of your cognitive processes. So we naturally induce things, but it takes researchers or philosophers or scientists, it takes them to identify the exact nature of that process. But I think humans do have the capacity to just naturally induce principles from what they observe in reality. It's just kind of like goes along with forming concepts. So I think it is the case that rationalists tend to focus on deduction from their idealistic axioms or concepts, but they originally got most of their concepts from an induction, I think. They're basic concepts they got from induction, but what happens is later in life, when they're going to school or they're taught by some crazy philosopher, they learn this bad method, and then they start applying that, and they drop the induction.
Yeah. That, I mean, I think that happens. And like you said, it can happen across different intellectual movements of people in school.
Yeah.
I like to think of Christian rationalists, not exclusively, but in monasteries. Just kind of, just spending all their time reading and just using that to achieve closeness with God or whatever their ideal happens to be.
Right. So in that case, a lot of the Bible contains moral lessons, in the parables, which are decent and which were probably induced, from experiences, but then they were turned into this like mystical form with miracles and all that in the story. And so when you get to like, a monk sitting down and reading just the Bible all day, then that's gonna develop a habit where they only look at these ideas, and it becomes ingrained in them that if I want knowledge, I got to go to this book, and that becomes their authority, and then they just go by that authority And if anything in reality seems to conflict with it, they gotta like ignore it or manipulate the interpretation of the text to make room
Right.
for reality.
To make it fit in somehow. Yeah. And I mean, you can see that across movements. In this,
And I think that's being done with objectivism now. I think that there's some manipulation of the text going on to make room for these wacky theories that some of the leading objectivists are coming up with.
that could be a whole separate show.
Yeah, probably.
In this next clip, Yaron is being interviewed by two young Brazilian objectivists, and they ask him about George Reisman's book on capitalism. And I think Yaron vacillates, says, I suspect he doesn't want to promote Reisman as someone who was kicked out of ARI, but yet he doesn't want to insult the questioner, and he knows Peikoff and even him held Reisman in high regard, so he kind of goes back and forth. And it seems to me he settles on rationalism as a charge that allows him to say the book is not well written, but yet not condemn Reisman morally.
Look, George Reisman is brilliant, and he knows economics. The book is it's a massive book. It's an encyclopedia. I don't think it's very well written, but it's got immense amount of knowledge in it. It's definitely an attempt to try to integrate objectivism into Austrian economics. Unfortunately, I think he makes some errors when it comes to that integration. This goes back to some of the issues about understanding objectivism.
Yaron calls it poorly written, but he seems to have as much problem with the attempt to integrate objectivism into Austrian economics. But then he blames Reisman's rationalism explicitly.
His main error is the accepts kind of von Mises's methodology, which is very rationalistic. He accepts a kind of methodology that is a little detached from reality. So he's rationalistic in the way he presents it. And I think a lot of is what, so, but I think overall, he's the only person we have who is an economist and is an Austrian economist and an objectivist who's written significantly on it. So I think as a consequence of accepting the bad methodology, there are significant errors in the book, but that shouldn't dismiss. We shouldn't dismiss the book because of that, because I think there's a lot of value in it.
So that's what I meant by he's all over the place. I mean, the poorly written book with errors is one that you shouldn't dismiss because we've got no one better. I mean, if only they had thought of getting someone better in the last 30 years since they booted Reisman, but that may be a bit too real world.
Well, he uses this term rationalist or rationalistic, as a kind of epithet with, without any justification. I don't know what he means. I mean, does he give examples? I don't know. I don't think so. I watched the rest of that clip, and I think he just calls him a rationalist and says he uses a rationalistic method, and then says von Mises did it too. And that may be true, but I don't know that, and I don't know what he means. So I think it's bad policy to, just use these terms and without trying to offer one example. Like, what is one example where Reisman was rationalistic?
I think he was saying it was too long, is in that sense that was how it was untied to reality. But you're right. I mean, accusing von Mises of rationalism too, do you see, it's like, it's a way of taking people that they have kind of a mixed relationship with, like a Reisman or Mises, and say, we don't like what you're doing, and this is our excuse to criticize it without us calling you evil. I mean, is rationalism even a bad charge if every, objectivist goes through it? I mean, I guess they're implying von Mises lived his whole life as a rationalist. I mean, can we get a list of which objectivists are over their rationalism?
It's kind of like pointing out the mole on some beautiful woman's face or something. You know, remember that example Ayn Rand
Yeah.
gave? It's like, if you think that Reisman's book is great and worth reading and all that, why not just leave it at that? You know, why does he, every single time he talks about Reisman, you know, he's got to bring up the negative or whatever, you know, whatever negative thought he has, it's like, that's important to say, you know, and he does that with, he did it with, you know, political candidates. Like, it's more understandable when he trashes Trump or something like that, but he doesn't even go, like with Trump, it was just all negative. It's like, okay, well, if you're going to be fair and balanced, why don't you start with the good? Because there was a lot of good in Trump. He wasn't a crazy leftist, you know. So I don't know what what his goal here is in communicating with his rhetoric. Like, is he trying to bring down Reisman, or is he trying to get people to read his book?
Well, with Trump, I think he genuinely, hated him. But with Reisman or von Mises, I think he's trying to appeal to multiple audiences. You've got the, Austrian economics fans of objectivism that, he doesn't want to totally alienate them. But on the other hand, you've got the Harry Binswanger and Peter Schwartz faction that were kind of engineered Reisman's ouster, and they're going to be the first to say, don't sanction the Austrians. And so it becomes a way of appealing to these multiple groups at the same time,
I guess, or alienating both. Depends on your perspective. Like, if
his way's gotten him this far.
If you're a big fan of Reisman, you want to hear him be called a rationalist, with no evidence.
Well, hey, at least they're still allowed to read him.
Yeah. It seems like if you're a fan of Reisman, you would just say, what is this guy talking about? He's just bashing on Reisman, because then they would focus on all like the negative things that Yaron is saying about it, because they already like Reisman. So then their focus is on like, well, what does he mean he's a rationalist? Because if they're a serious person, they want to know what part of Reisman's corpus is full of rationalism. It's kind of like saying, here's a bunch of fruit. One of them's poisoned. Have at it. If you don't tell me which one's poisoned, I'm not going to eat any of it.
That's the ultimate hope. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the negativity towards ARI approved people is a type of intellectual competition. I believe it's why the, libertarians and conservatives are so vilified, and even, Reisman and Mises and the Austrian economics. And so, and again, things have kind of mellowed from the days of just excommunicating people. So now they say, well, it's too rationalist.
Yeah, maybe he's getting tired of using dishonest. So now he's just going to focus on rationalism.
I guess that's a step in the right direction.
I have a feeling he has a whole list of these words he can bring up.
That's probably true. So what's the antidote to rationalism? Peikoff thinks it's digesting ideas better.
The only antidote to rationalism is detailed digesting in a proper way. If and when you can grasp the ideas in connection with reality, then there's no temptation to rationalism.
I think it's fascinating he characterized it as a temptation. And I don't know, maybe that reflects his past demons on the issue.
Yeah, maybe once the rationalism is identified, then you're kind of tempted to go back to it or to maintain it or use it, even though it's not good for you. Perhaps you struggle with an objective approach, so you got to use some method, right? You got to figure out some things somehow, so you resort to rationalism. But I think the antidote is accepting that first of all, you have to accept that you may be rationalistic in some or many categories of thought. And if you can't accept it, I mean, this might sound like an AA meeting at some point, but I think first you have to be able to accept that you might be rationalistic. And even if you don't understand like how you're rationalistic or even believe you're rationalistic, you might go to someone, like ask them, you think I'm being rationalistic here? And, get some input. Maybe so identifying your confusions, I think, is another big one. Is if you approach a topic and you're wishy-washy and you take both sides and you seem confused all the time, or people are accusing you of being that way, you might want to consider the idea that you're being rationalistic and really analyze your approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, that's what we were saying earlier. It's not necessarily an antidote in the sense that you always have to remain vigilant that we're not just slipping back into that mode of thinking because it's easier, safer, more fun in our bubbles.
Yeah. I mean, well, the second point I would make is that once you accept that you have rationalistic tendencies, you got to figure out the correct way, to do it, or you got to fix your bad habits, right? And maybe you don't know how to do that. So you would have to seek out somebody who can teach you, what you're doing wrong, how to correct it, give you some sort of instructions, or be able to convey to you in a way that you understand, what you're doing wrong and how to correct it. So that's probably one of the hardest parts, right? Is like, even if you grasp the idea or you accept the idea that you're being rationalistic, well, what do you do then? And that's part, and I think that's where Peikoff's coming in. He's suggesting you digest all the details and you go over all the facts and everything. And that's part of it. It's certainly, you have to do that. You have to retrain yourself to focus on reality, take an outward perspective, and really develop an analytical mind to see, is that thing in reality really what I have in my mind? Does it match with my concept? And you might have to look at several examples in order to determine that. And then you basically have to retrain yourself, to do that, to have a good habit of objectivity.
That's all good advice. I mean, I'm willing to accept that Peikoff did get over it, if evidenced by the fact that he's one of the only people in the ARI world that seems to get the threat of the woke establishment marching through the institutions over the last decade.
Right. Yeah. When you recognize something that's clear as day and, perfectly objective, and then you see other people who you thought were objective and they don't get it at all. Like, they're just totally confused about it. Like, I understood the transgender thing years and years ago. And I've literally been waiting years for people to come to the conclusions they're coming to now in the objective world. And Peikoff probably helped me discover that. I mean, he was one of the early, objectivist philosophers who figured it out, but I still disagreed with parts of his argument. But I think now objectivists are really grasping that subject, and some still aren't, but the ones who are, they finally kind of get it.
That could also be its own separate show. But I think we talked about some really good stuff. I think we talked about rationalism, what it is, and even, a little bit how to get over it. And that it's a process ultimately. I appreciate you talking about all this. I think you made some really good points. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad that you're interested in this topic, and I'm glad we had this conversation. I think it's an important conversation to have, even if, we made mistakes here, and because we're grasping at this issue as well to a certain degree. I think it's important to at least begin the conversation and put out some thoughts. It's clearly an issue in objectivism as well as generally the culture at large. So I think any sort of analysis of it, and at least a kind of scientific sort of look at it, is helpful. And hopefully the problem will get resolved some way. I think it's going to take a systematic approach, maybe actual mentors to help people get out of this rationalistic tendency.
Hopefully, OnCar's a mentor to many people. So
Yeah, I know it's hard to criticize, people for rationalism because you respect them in all kinds of different ways. And you're kind of saying something about their cognitive process. And I just want to end by reaffirming here that what Peikoff said is that this isn't really a moral issue. It's a cognitive one. It's a process issue and a self-awareness issue. So I think if anything we do, we should approach it as if we're dealing with some friends and we're trying to help them. And, we want them to see, what we understand. And so we need to be able to put together an objective argument, a clear-cut case for them so that we don't appear like we're just making shit up. We need to have our ducks in a row and understand the issues when we do point out something, that we think is rationalistic.
that's very objective of you. Keeping it real. That's what it's all about here at the Ayn Rand Fan Club. Well, I am Scott Schiff along with William Swig. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.